the Jews have to move from a place of fear and enslavement, Egypt, to what they thought was the promised land, right? They were just going to make that little trip across the Red Sea. Things are going to be okay. The story of Exodus is obviously a much older story probably than what's written down, what we read today. As you look at other traditions, what does it mean to be escaping enslavement, departing of a natural body of water, and then not getting to the promised land, but actually just getting to the wilderness?
Well, we never get to the promised land, really, do we? Because, you think, well, I'm going to graduate from high school, and then I'm there, and then you graduate from high school, and that's an accomplishment. But then your frame collapses because you're not a high school student anymore, and you're sort of at the pinnacle of being a student of high school, grade 12, the pinnacle, and then bang, you're at the bottom again. You're like the new guy at the job if you don't go to college, or you're a beginning freshman, and what do you know? And so then it's up the hill again, and you think, well, I'm going to graduate in 4 years, and when I graduate, well, that's the pinnacle. And then you get there, and the same thing happens. And that's another example of the collapse of narratives, in some sense, that characterize our lives. And so, and the promised land is something that beckons, so is it real? Well, people hate it when I say this, but it depends on what you mean by real. Because, when someone asks, is it real, they have a bunch of ideas about what real is, and they're all examined. They just think it's obvious. It's like, almost nothing is less obvious than what's real. That's a really hard question. What do you mean by that? Do you mean what's true? Do you mean what's practical? Do you mean what's beautiful? Do you mean what's objectively true? Like, what do you mean exactly? Well, you don't know what you mean. You just say real, and you think that means what you think it means, and you don't even think about it. So the promised land beckons. So does that mean it's real? Well, it beckons. It's like there's something better waiting for you. Well, how good could it get? Who knows? Who knows? That's the paradisal vision. That's the promised land. But you go through tyranny and the chaos of the desert repeatedly to get there. And maybe you meld yourself into something that's capable of, what would you say, of embodying the promised land as you go through that process. And maybe the promised land is something psychological in that sense that's dependent on the development of your character. And maybe the more developed your character, the more the promised land is everywhere around you all the time. I mean, why wouldn't that be the case? Is a wise man better situated than a fool? Well, if so, then he's already more in the promised land.
In a way. You've quoted Chekhov's classic line that if there's a gun over the mantle in the first act, it better be used by the third act. Right? So there has to be some specific reason why there was a parting of a body of water. What does that?
There's many reasons.
But archetypally, what does that mean? That the Jews are cornered, it's all over, they've given their freedom, they think, but Pharaoh comes after them. Now they're, in really a difficult setup, pushed up against the water, the Egyptian troops coming at them, they're unarmed, and suddenly God opens up the water. They pass through again, not knowing where they're going, but they trust the process.
Yeah, well, Moses is, one of the things that underlies the Exodus narrative is the metaphoric and literary juxtaposition of stone imagery with water imagery. And the Pharaoh in Egypt is the land of stone. Pyramids are stone, and everything's set in stone. And that's a good thing because stone is durable and permanent, but it isn't flexible, it doesn't move. And so that's the downside of stone. And water can wear away stone.
Yeah.
And water has all sorts of properties that stone doesn't have. And if everything around you is stone, then you die of thirst. Right, and that's a spiritual image as well, right? You've rigidified everything, nothing moves. Well, then you die of thirst. Something has to move. And Moses is always presented as a master of water. I mean, water saves him right at the beginning of his life. And there's water imagery associated with Moses all the way through the story. And so the parting of the Red Sea is part of that. It's also a symbolic border between the tyrannical land of stone and what the well-watered place, which is what Eden means. That's, if I remember correctly, or is it paradise? Either paradise or Eden means well-watered place. Mm-hmm. And that's the promised land that beckons. And there's much more to it, and that's by no means a complete explanation, but it's all I can manage to bring to mind at the moment.
They get to the wilderness, not where they thought they were going to be.
No, that's not where they thought they were
And
going to
maybe
be.
that's a good place for us to talk about the world today.
Yeah,
Because
fragmented.
Worshiping idols.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you've got Moses up there collecting 2 tablets. One
Yes.
highlighting the first 5 commandments, our relationship to the divine, and the other tablet, our relationship to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's a story that's as
Well, you
old as...
received revelation at the top of mountains, and they're close to God, symbolically speaking, right? But the mountain is also a representation of the hierarchy of value. That's the pyramid. That's why the Egyptians worshipped it. That's why the Washington Monument has a cap on it that's made out of aluminum, which was more valuable than gold when it was made. And that's a symbolic representation of the state itself. And the state itself is organized under the highest possible principle, and it's at the pinnacle that you encounter the highest possible principle, and that's why Moses encounters God there. And so if a revelation occurs to you, then at the highest level of value, then in some sense you're at the pinnacle of something that's much more mountainous than just a mountain. Mm-hmm. It's a meta mountain. It's like the mountain of all mountains, the value structure that governs our perceptions. And Moses, while he's leading his people through the desert, is called on constantly to adjudicate disputes. They're all fractionated and fighting, like they're no longer under the integrated control of a tyrant, let's say. So now they're fighting with each other all the time about what should be done, and they don't have laws and all of that. And so Moses is constantly adjudicating, and I think it's his father-in-law tells him to quit doing that because it's going to wear him out and kill him. He's doing it so much. Mm-hmm. So he's spending untold hours over untold years sorting things out, subduing things, and arranging a hierarchy of value, because that's how you make judgments when you're in difficult situations. You have to say, this is higher than this. You're right, he's wrong. Here's the hierarchy of values. And then, bang, all of that manifests itself in his imagination as a set of explicit principles that should guide behavior. And it's a staggering moment, because what was up till then ritual and custom, in some sense only acted out, now becomes stateable and propositional. It's a massive transformation, and that's what that part of the story signifies. Now, it's a relationship to objective history. Well, that's a very thorny issue. It's like the relationship of a Dostoevsky novel to objective history. It's like nothing in a Dostoevsky novel ever happened, but it's all true. And so then you say, well, what do you mean it's all true? It's like, well, you can think about that for a while. It's also deep. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means something. Well, what it means in part is that it deals with fundamental values, and those are values upon which many other values are predicated. And so all of that. And so is the story of Moses true? No, it's meta-true. It's more than true, just like great literature. It's concentrated truth. So just to call it, maybe you're a fundamentalist and you say, well, that actually happened. Well, it's like, well, what do you mean? You have no idea how complicated that proposition that you just uttered is. It's like, no, it didn't actually happen. It more than happened. You're undervaluing it by putting it in that category. It's way more true than normal truth. And we don't really understand that, that kind of truth. Not really. We can approach it. We do that when we have reverence for great literature, and even utter the proposition that there is such a thing as great and lesser literature, which of course has become, fundamentally debatable in modern times. So, even though it's clearly the case.
So, Moses is aged by receiving those commandments. And he's also, despite all the things he's been doing, not allowed to go to the promised land. Mm-hmm. Why? Are there some questions we're not supposed to ask, or some questions that are so heavy they're
he's not Christ.
No, he's not Christ.
No, that's really the answer, is that you don't get to the promised land unless you're Christ. I know there are exceptions to that idea, but that idea is still germane. And what that means about what the promised land is, and what that means about what Christ is and how that's related to Moses, those are insanely complicated problems, questions, and our whole culture has been trying to parse out the answers. Well, I can tell you, let me just take a sidestep here. What does the idea that God himself was incarnated in Christ mean? I'm going to speak psychologically and to the degree that that's possible. Well, one of the problems that Mircea Eliade, who's a great historian of religions, pointed out about an abstract notion of God. So let's say you posit that the thing that's at the top of your value hierarchy is God, and it becomes this abstract good, and it becomes ever more abstract. The problem then becomes, well, what relationship does that have with your day-to-day life? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is increasingly less, then God floats off in some sense into abstraction and disappears. That's the death of God that Nietzsche described. And Eliade, who was a great historian of religion, says that has happened to us many times. The idea of God had become so abstracted that it floated off, and we lost all connection with that tradition, that ethical tradition.
That's happened to us many times?
Yes, according to Eliade, over the course of history.
Huh.
Well, religions have transformed and arisen and died across time. And so he thought of it as a...
Well, what happens to civilizations that don't have those archetypes, those vessels that we have to fill with whatever values and insights we have?
I guess we're finding out.
Yeah, we are finding out.
You bet we are, and we haven't found out yet. But we're going to. So what's supposed to be at the top? Well, is it inclusion? Is it diversity? Is it equity? Is it all three of them? Well, this is all a battle for what's in the highest place. All of this. What's in the highest place? As far as I'm concerned, it's the divine word. Well, what if you don't believe that? Well, and what do you mean by believe? Well, I would say to believe that is to be terrified, if you have any sense, because you can say things that aren't true. And God help you, especially if you do that knowingly. So to say the divine word is at the penultimate position, and has to be, to understand that is to be constantly terrified, and that's a terrible thing. But the alternative is far worse. And that's endless fragmentation and conflict acted out violently. You have to put what should be at the top. And that's the unifying principle, right, under which all other values are organized. And a lot of, we're arguing about, well, whether there even is such a thing, and there better be, because how else are we going to be unified? Out of many, one, after all. And the many and the one are both real. Mm-hmm. So what's the one? Well, that's a hard question, and people have been trying to figure that out forever. And the entire religious enterprise is to figure out what's one. Well, back to the idea of the abstract God. Well, partly the way you deal with the problem of that abstraction is to have the highest value embodied, right? To actually be in a person. Because then you can imitate it, you can act it out, which is the point. Now, and this is all independent in some sense of the reality, the way modern objective materialists think of reality. It's all independent of the reality of that. Because this is partly a discussion about what constitutes reality. Now, you can think about this in your own mind. It's like, well, what tortures you when you do something wrong? And can you escape that? It's like you can try, you can pretend, but there's no place to hide. And everyone knows that. And if you meet someone who doesn't, it's like, you better get away from them quick. Because for obvious reasons, no conscience, And conscience, it's this weird thing that's independent. It's like, why can't you control that thing? Why doesn't it just do what you tell it to do? Wouldn't life be so much easier if you could just tell that pesky little monster what it should be saying to you? You'd just be at peace. It's like, what I did is okay. It's always okay. No one thinks that way. So what is it that's torturing us with our ethical inadequacy? You don't think that's real? You might say, I wish so much it wasn't real. I will devote my entire intellectual enterprise to destroying the notion that it's a valid voice. Man, you can see why people would be motivated to do that. It's a lot easier than trying to get yourself straightened out.
See, that's why I think people don't like you.
Yeah.
That's the real reason.
Yeah, that's the real reason. Yeah. But, it's not me. Dispense with me and the problem doesn't go away. Because it's not me, right?